Edward Dutton is Professor of Evolutionary Psychology at Asbiro University, Poland, and Honorary Professor at the Institute of Psychology, the Russian Academy of Sciences, Moscow. He originally read theology at Durham and Aberdeen, and he's quite happy researching and writing controversial topics, including intelligence and the woke mind. He's the author of many books, including this one, At Our Wits End, whose thesis is that we're all becoming less intelligent. So, Edward Dutton, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Tell me, is it true that we are becoming less intelligent as a society or as individuals? How does that thesis pan out? How does it work?
We are becoming less intelligent. Yes, we were under harsh Darwinian selection pressure until the Industrial Revolution, until about 1800, and the child mortality rate was about 50%. And we know from parish records and from wills that the richer 50% had about double the surviving fertility of the poorer 50%. And the heritability across generations of socioeconomic status is about 0.75. And in general, the genetic component of, for example, how wealthy you are is about 40%. So all of this implies that we were selecting for intelligence. We were bootstrapping the population every generation. Every generation, those at the bottom died off. And historians will tell you that we were a society of social descent. Every generation, the average person was of a lower status in a rank society than his father, because the people at the bottom would die off and you'd have to move down to fill up those spaces. We know that across time our heads were getting bigger, consistent with rising intelligence. Even though societal conditions weren't changing that much, we were becoming more literate, we were becoming more numerate, we were becoming less violent, interest rates were going down, which is consistent with people being more future-oriented. And indeed, we now have, from analyses of ancient genomes, we know that alleles that are associated indirectly with intelligence, that are associated with very high educational attainment, were increasing in prevalence in Western populations. And then this is reflected in the fact that things like per capita levels of per capita major innovation, i.e. genius, were increasing across time. The degree to which we were using high order words in representative corpuses of texts were increasing across time. So on all of these measures, we were becoming more intelligent, which is consistent with the breakthrough of the Industrial Revolution. And then when that happens, of course, then you have this collapse in child mortality from 50% of the population to 1% of the population now. So that's the first thing that's changed. So all of these children that would have been from the bottom of society that would have died off are not dying off and are living and are passing on their genes. And secondly, via various processes, you then have, by about 1900, evidence of a negative association in Western societies between intelligence and how many children you have. Contraception is one reason. It's taken up by the more intelligent, and it's a kind of a test of intelligence. Feminism is another reason. The more intelligent woman gets involved in education and delays and limits her fertility. Welfare is another reason. And another reason is just that it seems that intelligent people are more environmentally sensitive. And so if you put them in an evolutionary mismatch, i.e. low child mortality, and they don't want to have children. But for all these reasons, we now know the prevalence of alleles associated with intelligence in the population is decreasing. Per capita major innovation reached a peak in about 1870 and is now back to where it was in 1600. Reaction times, which were measured the same way in the 1880s as they are now, have increased. Reaction times correlate with intelligence at about 0.3, and they have increased commensurate with, between the 1880 and the year 2000, a 15-point fall in IQ, which is the difference between a policeman and a science teacher, something like that. Our backward digit span, your use of high order vocabulary, mathematical ability, numerous other things, they all point in the same direction, which is that we are becoming less intelligent. Yes.
Well, I have to say that's an impressive array of evidence and reasons. Can I just wind back a little bit, because I want to test something out right at the very core of what you're saying. First of all, when we test for intelligence, can we be confident that our intelligence tests are measuring a valid non-cultural quantity? And secondly, can we be sure that the measure of the intelligence that we have through the various tests and psychological tests that we have is the same intelligence that you've just been talking about in terms of evolutionary aspect? Are we measuring the same thing?
Well, what we mean by intelligence is we mean the ability to solve cognitive problems and how quickly you can solve them. And the ability to do that increases up to middle age, up to about the mid-40s or 50, something like that. And so we call it intelligence quotient. We measure it against people of your own cohort, IQ. Intelligence tests correlate with numerous, strongly often, with, first of all, with numerous other things that we would think intuitively measure that ability. I'm not saying those things are independent of cultural pressures, but how well you do in school exams, how well you do in education, how well you can manage money, socioeconomic status, interest in ideas, the ability to think abstractly, all kinds of measures that we would intuitively think are related to the ability to solve, even things like, as I said, how quickly you can deal with something. They all correlate with intelligence. So I think it's reasonable to say that that there is something that we're getting at that is a core factor. Secondly, though it is true that IQ tests are an imperfect instrument via which to measure something like intelligence, there are going to be cultural biases to them, and this is why we have different tests that are more or less culturally biased. IQ scores correlate with objective measures that can be employed cross-culturally and indeed cross-historically, most obviously brain size. So the brain is a thinking muscle, and the size of a person's brain correlates at about 0.3 with how intelligent they are, how well they do on IQ tests. The other one is reaction times. So you give a person a bank of lights and they press a button when a particular light comes on. These again correlate at about 0.3 with how well you do in an IQ test. So this is showing us that this is an objective measure. Also, it's talked about, or something similar to it is discussed in all cultures, even anthropological analyses. When they talk about the chief, and they talk about, oh, the chief, he knows more, he has greater knowledge. Well, general knowledge correlates with IQ at about 0.5. So I think that on every level, we're tapping into something objective, and the heritability in adulthood of IQ is about 0.8. So it's very strongly genetic. It's lower among children because the adults or the school or whatever are creating their environment. Whereas once you get older, that's 16 to 18, then you start creating your own environment consistent with your own innate IQ. And then your intelligence will either rise because you've been held back, you've been retarded by your childhood environment, or it will fall. Or it will stay the same. But that the heritability is 0.8 in adulthood. The one interesting nuance about the IQ rise across time, which I look at in that book, is the Flynn effect.
Yeah.
And this is what was noticed was that the what all the data is indicating is that we were becoming less intelligent from about maybe 1850 or maybe 1900 onwards. But yet IQ scores are increasing every generation. And they were doing so up until about the generation born in 1980. And I corresponded with Flynn, as you saw, he endorsed the book. We were both very interested in this stuff. And what seemed to be going on was that intelligence should be understood as a bit like a pyramid. So at the bottom of the pyramid, you have specialized abilities that are weakly associated with intelligence, such as the ability to, I don't know, do up your shoelaces or tie a tie or drive a car. And then as you move up, as you factor analyze it, you get three key forms of intelligence: verbal, mathematical, and spatial. And these in themselves, people that do well in one tend to do well in the other. And so then they factor down into what we call general intelligence, which is the essence of intelligence. Now, what was going on with the Flynn effect was that Flynn suggests it was living in an increasingly scientific and literate society, was forcing a massive increase in scores on certain specialized abilities, i.e., similarities, the ability to notice similarities between shapes. And it was doing so to such an extent and so quickly that it was overwhelming everything else that was happening on the IQ test. And it was coming across as an IQ rise because it was such a dramatic rise in these specialized abilities that weakly are associated with intelligence. Now, while that was happening, on the more G-loaded, on the more intelligence measuring components of the IQ battery, we were becoming less intelligent. But this was being cloaked by this massive rise in these, because the environment was changing. So suddenly the nature of the environment was altering. It wasn't like a stop clock. It wasn't something across time. IQ tests work measuring people at the same time, but if you're measuring people across time, then the environment is changing, and the IQ tests are environmentally sensitive for that reason, i.e. that you could have a more stimulating environment and it could push the results up. That doesn't necessarily mean that the people are becoming more intelligent across time. It could be quite the opposite. It was a cloaking effect whereby what was happening genetically was being cloaked by this thing that was happening environmentally. Now, what we would predict if we were indeed becoming less intelligent was that eventually that environmental effect would reach its phenotypic maximum. And then the underlying intelligence fall would poke through even on the IQ tests. And that's what happened. In the generation born in about 1979, then we get a negative Flynn effect. And you can then look at, well, what's that negative Flynn effect on? We know that the positive Flynn effect is on the most environmentally sensitive subcomponents of the test. And a number of studies have found that, at least at first, the negative Flynn effect was on the most genetically mediated components of the test. So this is an interesting phenomenon, but it's not inconsistent with the general fall in intelligence.
So just to rewind a little bit, there is such a thing as intelligence. It's 80%, I think you said, genetically component of it, whereas that presumably means 20% is environmental. But the environmental impact only really gets eliminated a little bit or gets evened out by the time you get to be an adult. Is that right?
Yeah, so you can imagine, I mean, I can think of many situations like this in my own life. I remember a chap I was at school with, okay, and he had very, very middle-class parents, very educated parents, and he was doing reasonably well at school. Tellingly, he wasn't very good at maths, and maths is quite a good indicator of how intelligent somebody is. Now, he was doing very well at school, and then but then as he starts to create his own environment, because he's, for whatever reason, less intelligent than his parents, he then starts to go off. Things start to deteriorate, and he ends up buggering up his A-levels, going to a mediocre university, and then not even being able to get his degree from there, like dropping out of that. And that's reflecting the way in which he had every advantage in life. He was pushed to his phenotypic maximum intelligence by these very intelligent parents and whatever. But then once he reached mid-teens, late teens, and he was creating his own environment more consistent with innate intelligence, his intelligence started to go down. Because of the environment he was creating, and also because of the kind of people he was associating with. He would have been drawn towards people with a similar intelligence level to his own, and so he would no longer have been stimulating his mind to its phenotypic maximum.
Yeah. Are there?
Oh, sorry.
No,
what was that?
you're right.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Right, yeah. Okay, sorry, yes.
I was just saying, are there any other components to intelligence? I've seen that there is some research trying to indicate there's something called emotional intelligence and maybe other different kinds of intelligence. Do these things exist and do they have an impact upon what you're talking
I
about?
think that well, you're talking about the multiple intelligences
Yeah.
model. I think they exist, but I don't think that they are. I mean, as I look at it in the book, I think that something like emotional intelligence, what that can, yes, it is true that there is a relationship between intelligence and the ability to solve social problems, like a weak relationship. But it seems to me that what emotional intelligence is something from the world of personality. Although there is some evidence of a very weak correlation between the kind of personality you have and intelligence.
We're talking about the big five
The
here, are
big
we?
five. Well,
Yeah.
that's how people, the most psychologists accept the big five model. So the big five is ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the heritability of each of these is on average about 0.5. Um, and as with intelligence, they allow interesting and correct predictions to be made about people's life history and all this sort of thing. There is some evidence of a very weak correlation between like a genetically pro-social personality, shall we say, and intelligence, something like that. But in general, they're basically separate. And I think that emotional intelligence is basically it's an element of agreeableness.
Right.
There's two
Is,
components to
is,
agreeableness. One is
is there,
altruism.
is
Sorry.
there no correlation between IQ scores or G or something of that nature and your score on the big five? Is
Yeah,
there,
yeah. There's some studies that have indicated that there is a very weak relationship, um, and this would make sense in so much as one, I think, quite fruitful model through which we could understand human interaction is so-called life history theory, and this is that we are all on a spectrum between a fast and a slow life history. A fast life history is you are evolved to an easy yet unstable ecology, and so you live fast, die young, and you invest most of your energy in copulation and not much in nurture or whatever. The idea you live fast, die young, because you could be wiped out at any minute. And so there's that selects in favor of violence, aggression. It doesn't select against mental instability. It doesn't select to be group oriented or anything like that. And then as the species reaches its carrying capacity, and you get a harsh yet stable ecology, then of course, if you just have lots of sex, don't invest in your offspring, they could all just die. And it's highly competitive, so you have to become evolved to that very specific ecology, and so therefore you slow everything down. You have a childhood in which you can learn about how to behave and whatever. You need to become more cooperative into groups, and so this militates in favor of being pro-social and mentally stable. And also because you have all of these problems to solve and you have to compete, it selects for intelligence. And so it would follow that there should be some kind of relationship between a slow life history strategy, i.e., that you're pro-social and mentally stable, and intelligence. And there is some weak evidence that people that are more intelligent will go through puberty later and things that indicate a slower life history.
but generally speaking, they're mostly independent
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
So in other words, you can be a sociopath and highly intelligent, or you can be very agreeable and highly intelligent, or low intelligence in each case. So you can have
Yeah,
any
except
combination of
I
those.
suppose it's a bit complicated by the fact that a person that is intelligent may, by virtue of being intelligent, display more agreeable traits. For example, if you are low in intelligence, you tend to be lower in trust. Why? Well, because you're more likely to be conned. So it makes sense if you are low in intelligence to trust nobody. Whereas if you're high in intelligence, you are better able to discern the motives and the likely outcomes of dealing with different kinds of people just logically. And so therefore it pays to be more trusting and this will permit opportunities for you which you otherwise wouldn't be able to
Well,
take.
but I mean, based on trust, society is built up on in that kind of way. Without trust, you don't have anything, do you? Really, in terms of a social connection.
No,
Or,
no, exactly. So there's no. You could argue that in a fast life history strategy ecology, precisely because if you do a favor for somebody, it may never be paid back because they could be wiped out. There is absolutely no reason to develop the bonds of trust at all.
yeah.
You may as well just live for yourself. But yeah, as returning to the main topic, in general, personality and intelligence are quite separate, and I think that what Gardner and people like this are talking about with these multiple intelligences is basically it's just, and he's pretty much admitted this, by the way, that it's wrong. He's basically said, "Oh, I may be wrong, but at least I'm moral." Because it allows everybody to be intelligent, doesn't it? I mean, it's like when you're at infant school and you're playing a game and oh, let's find who's going to be the leader, and some particularly perceptive and socially skilled child will say, oh, why can't we all be leaders?
Mm.
If everybody's a leader, then nobody's a leader. If everybody's somebody, then no one's anybody. And if everybody's intelligent, then no one's intelligent. Intelligence, by definition, has to be a relative concept that someone is more intelligent, i.e., better at solving cognitive problems and solving them more quickly than somebody else.
Are there any demographic differences which you would be prepared to mention in terms of intelligence? I know this is a controversial area, and certainly some people like Charles Murray have got their fingers burned in talking about this kind of a field. But for example, between males and females, is there a difference in median intelligence,
Yes,
or
yes,
between
in
different
adult,
cultures and races?
adult. Yeah, well, I've written a lot about this. I did a book called Making Sense of Race. Um, in adulthood, women go through, so when boys and girls are children, their average intelligence is about the same. But then girls go through puberty earlier, and so then their intelligence is higher than that of boys at the age of sort of 15, something like that. And then boys go through puberty later, and then that militates in favor of substantial brain growth. And so then by the time we get to the age of about 21, then males have on average about a 4-point excess of IQ over women. And in particular, males are much more spatially and mathematically tilted, whereas women are more linguistically tilted. But overall, it's a 4-point or something like that, a 4-point
4 points.
excess.
I thought that the median was the same, but just that the spread was
No,
wider in
it's
males.
about a 4-point excess, and this makes sense because men have to solve complex problems to do with building and shelters and hunting and this sort of thing. So you'd expect to be more intelligent. And women sexually select for status in men, and one of the big predictors of status is intelligence. So there would be a degree to which you should expect women to sexually select for intelligence. And on average, indeed, a husband is a few points more intelligent than his wife. The second issue, which you've alluded to already, is the spread, as you say. This is the male variability hypothesis. So basically, we are evolved to live in polygamous mating systems in which the majority of males will not breed, but the majority of females will breed. Even in recent field work among the, well, not anymore, but in field work in the 70s, among the Bushmen of the Kalahari, found that only about 40% of the males breed. So that means that if you're a male, statistically, you're unlikely to breed. So you might as well, as a male, just come up with random genes because you've nothing to lose, basically. I mean, statistically, you're probably not going to pass on your genes. So you might as well just be more genetically diverse in the hope that something works.
I mean, I heard that outside the Kalahari. I mean, I think it's only 50%, isn't it, of males have children. Is that right? And whereas a larger number, much larger number of females have children.
Yeah.
Women, as you say,
Kalahari, 40% of males have children. Well, it was the case among the Bushmen
yeah.
when they were operating as Bushmen rather than just living in concentration camps as they now do. It's something like that. And so you get greater male variability. And so the result is that you get greater male variability in terms of personality, and you get greater male variability in terms of intelligence. And so you get more men that are mentally retarded, and you get more men that are very, very intelligent. And you can see this overall in the way in which you get more men who are geniuses. Well, what are geniuses? To the extent that genius is genetic, it's unlikely but possible combinations, i.e., outlier high intelligence, which is unlikely, combined with basically psychopathic traits. And as we saw earlier, in general, there is a weak negative association between psychopathy and intelligence. So you've got to have this genetic diversity for that to be thrown up.
Right.
The other, yeah,
go ahead.
the other question you asked about was race differences. So obviously there are race differences. It's been found that there are race differences in alleles, which are associated indirectly via being associated with having a PhD or something, a very high level of intelligence, with intelligence, and the correlation between national IQs and the prevalence of those alleles is about 0.9. So this is showing you that there are genetic race differences in intelligence. And although it's true, you can say that there are problems with the tests and that they're biased and whatever. That's the key counter argument. There are other counter arguments I can put. For example, there are consistent race differences in brain size in the right direction. There are consistent race differences in reaction times in the right direction. And of course, those differences are going to exist because if you adopt farming, then this becomes a selection event in favor of future orientation, basically in favor of intelligence. That's the first thing. And secondly, if it is cold and difficult, then there are more problems to solve. And so this is going to select in favor of intelligence. And thirdly, if it is cold and difficult, you will get more group selection. You will get more battling between groups for resources. And this will militate in favor of the more intelligent group that's better able to come up with brilliant weapons or whatever. So it should be no surprise that there are group differences in intelligence. I mean, there are also group differences in all kinds of other fascinating traits. The Australian Aborigines, for example, in terms of specialized abilities at the base of the pyramid, it's quite incredible the things they can do. They have amazing spatial memory, which means that they can track people through hundreds of miles of the bush. Or similarly with the Arctic peoples, their average IQ is about 10 points lower than that of European, but they have much bigger brains. They have by far the largest brains of any race. And this seems to be because they have all kinds of specialized abilities which have rendered them adapted to that very specific ecology.
Right. Your comment earlier on that females select partners based partly upon intelligence, and they're looking for presumably partners who are at least as intelligent as them, if not more intelligent than they are. Doesn't that mitigate or militate, I should say, against your thesis that the selection process is actually making IQ go down? If the females are selecting more intelligent people, wouldn't that make it go up?
No. First of all, the negative correlation between intelligence and breeding is stronger among women. So what's increasingly happening is that, to a much greater extent than is the case with men, intelligent women resign from the gene pool. Intelligent women don't have children. So much more so than the case among intelligent men. A, because of course there's a built-in limit if you're a woman, you go through the menopause. B, I suspect because they're just more environmentally sensitive. And C, interestingly, with regard to that point, we are now at a point in Western countries where men are as educated or even less educated than women. So it would follow that if you're a woman, you will of course want to sexually select for a man that's at least as educated as you. And there's just not enough. So the result is that they, become lesbians or cat ladies or whatever. They don't pass on. I mean, you saw a similar process. This is very interesting, actually. World War One was a very interesting selection event because the percent of the troops that were killed was 8%. 8% of the men that went out were killed. But it was 12% of the officers. And the officers were drawn very substantially from the middle class. For example, if you went to a public school, you were automatically put in officer training corps. And obviously, if you were more intelligent, you would be more likely to be able to rise from being a non-commissioned officer to being an officer. So the officers were more intelligent. And also, by the way, I should say that there is a correlation not just between socioeconomic status of outcome and IQ, but also socioeconomic status into which you're born, which is demonstrating, the heritability of this. So this was a selection event. 12% of the officers are killed. And then what was the result? The result was this spinster crisis after World War One, in which all of these middle class, if you look at literature from, the Darling Buds of May or even Fawlty Towers, you will remember the presence of these spinsters that were born circa 1898, whatever. And of course, upper class, upper middle, and they didn't have anyone to marry, so they didn't marry. So women are very environmentally sensitive. I think more environmentally sensitive than men. And so they so I don't think that militates against it. You just have lots of women not. It's if anything, it's the females that are pushing the decline in intelligence to a much greater extent than the males. And in fact, there are some countries in the West where, from the most recent data, there isn't a negative correlation between intelligence and how many children you have. Finland is seemingly one. There isn't, that correlation is not there for various reasons. They industrialized later or whatever. No, I don't think that argument pushes against it. And also, it just factually doesn't, because we know that the intelligence is going down. So whatever's going on, we know it's going down on so many measures.
Is the declining fertility rate affecting intelligence specifically? I know that in the West, for example, places like France, England, Norway, even, I think the fertility rate is less than replacement rate, sometimes 1.6 or
So there's you can look at the sociology of fertility, and there was a very interesting. Remember, the heritability of intelligence about 0.8, heritability of personality about 0.5, and there's a very interesting book called The Welfare Trait by Adam Perkins, interesting fellow. Perhaps you should interview him. And what he showed was that if you divide society up into those where both parents are working, IQ about 100, those where one parent is on welfare, IQ, I don't know, 90, those where both parents are on welfare, IQ, let's say 85, and those where both parents are on welfare and you have to have involvement from the social workers and the police and things like this, i.e. the criminal underclass, IQ about 80. It is only that group that has above replacement fertility in Western countries among the native population.
Yeah.
So
I mean, in other countries, in the Middle East, for example, it's much higher, of course.
What is?
The replacement rate.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
Sure. Rate. Yeah.
So you have a low replacement rate. I don't know what we're at the moment, but we're certainly below 2. We're below replacement fertility. I don't know, 1.8 or something in
I think it's lower than that now. 1.6, I think.
1.6 in among native English people.
Yeah.
And then you have the fact that who is doing the breeding. Well, there's two kinds of people. It's quite interesting. One is those that have low intelligence. They are breeding. The other, and we look at this in the successor book to Our Wits End, The Past is Future Country, and also in a more recent book I did called Woke Eugenics, is if you control for intelligence, what happens? So if you let's say you just look at those that have an IQ of above 115, if you control for intelligence, who is breeding then? And then you find that the big predictor of sterility is that you are liberal and you are an atheist. And the heritability of this is about 0.6.
Interesting.
And the big predictor of fertility is that you are highly religious in the traditional sense of the collective worship of a moral God, and that you are conservative. Again, heritability of about 0.6. So that's quite interesting. So there's almost like a coming apart where, and also the other thing that predicts breeding is essentially being genetically sick. So IQ, genetic intelligence, genetically correlates with genetic health, because under harsh conditions we're selecting for both, so they become bundled together. In effect, under harsh conditions we're selecting for intelligence, but we're also selecting essentially for conservatism, religiosity, and being group oriented. And those things are highly heritable, and they then associate, those things are themselves associated with mental and physical health. And we're selecting for this bundle. And now we are selecting against this bundle. So not only are we becoming less intelligent, we're becoming less genetically healthy. And then you have this interesting nuance, which is that, that among the more intelligent, then it's almost like it's genetic health, conservatism, and religiosity that are being selected for.
So are you saying, can I put this more crudely and more bluntly, are you saying that conservatives, so there's a correlation between conservative outlook, religious outlook, theistic outlook, and intelligence itself, and similarly liberal outlook, woke outlook?
Well, no. I would put intelligence aside there. No, that's complicated. I did a book actually about 10 years ago called Religion and Intelligence. So that there's
Is there any correlation then between religion?
No, there's an interesting there's a negative correlation between intelligence. Well, no, there was. I mean, perhaps not anymore. But there was a negative correlation between intelligence and religiosity. Quite why we can look at if you like. But one point is that people who are intelligent within the normal range are more socially conformist. So intelligent people are better able to look around the world and notice what the dominant set of values is, and then force themselves via a kind of innate effortful control to imbibe and adopt those values.
Let's call that adaptation then.
Yeah, and then competitively signal those values. And so in general, you expect intelligent people to be more socially conformist. Now, I don't have data on it, but what I would expect is that in a highly religious society, I would expect intelligent people to be religious. And I would not the outliers, not the outliers, not the kind of John Stuart Mill types, but within the normal within the normal range.
I have read somewhere, and maybe you can correct me if I've got this wrong, that if you look at races by intelligence, that those near the top by an extra 10 points are highly religious. The Ashkenazi Jews tend to be very high on the intelligence scale. Is that anything to do with their culture or their religion, or is there a correlation that or not?
Yeah, there is the average IQ of Ashkenazi Jews is about 112, and of the American samples, and there are 120 on linguistic intelligence. And it's been suggested that there's a number of reasons for this. One is that because they were basically funneled into finance and things like this in Western countries. And so if you weren't intelligent enough to be able to deal with that, you basically dropped out of the Ashkenazi population. No. Secondly, once that was the case, then very intelligent people who would marry, white people would marry specifically into the Ashkenazi Jewish population. Thirdly, you have a lot of selection events, pogroms and things like that, and intelligent people would be more likely to plan ahead and whatever and survive those selection events. And it's even been argued by Harpending and somebody or other that Tay-Sachs disease, for example, if you have one allele, then this elevates intelligence. But if you have two, you have Tay-Sachs. And so Tay-Sachs stays in the population. But they are, and we definitely, I mean, we've got studies on this. They are genetically more intelligent. Yeah, that's That's certainly true. I'm not sure about them being more. I mean, I've got a study in this book that I did in 2014 from the 20s, which found that more intelligent kids that were Ashkenazi were less religious. But
That's what.
but I think that what happens is that gradually, as society becomes less religious, then there's probably a tendency for people who are more intelligent to be less instinctive. Because if you think about it, if to solve a problem, you have to rise above your instincts. You have to rise above that which is inbuilt to solve a problem. A lot of people get certain mathematical questions wrong because there's an instinctive response, and then there's the logical response.
Yeah.
So you would expect intelligence to be associated with low instinct, and there's some evidence for that. There's some evidence that people that are more intelligent are environmentally more sensitive for longer. Now, there's also evidence that belief in God is an instinct. It has all of the components of an instinct. It's highly heritable. It hits in at times of stress. It's associated with fertility. All of the markers of an adaptation. So you would expect people that were more environmentally sensitive, i.e., more intelligent, to be less, unless all else being equal, to be less prone to believe in God. And so if you place then a strong social pressure on people to believe in God, then you would expect intelligent people to force themselves to believe in God. And this seems to be true. If you go back to data from the 30s in America, people that are highly intelligent still seem to believe in God. Once you loosen that pressure, that pressure, that's social pressure, that's forcing you to believe in, to conform, then you start to see the difference. And this is exactly what you start to see from the 20s onwards. You start to see this weak negative relationship between belief in God and intelligence. And then eventually what you start to see is the rise of an atheistic ideology, postmodernism, whatever, which then via trickle effect makes its way down the society so that less and less intelligent people don't believe in God. And now we've got to a point where, in the most recent data I've got, there is no longer a relationship between religious belief and intelligence. It's stopped. And
no longer a connection. There's no correlation between whether you're religious.
not in the most recent samples, i.e., people born in sort of 1990.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if it flips the other way, because what you're seeing is among the more intelligent, what is being strongly selected for is religiosity. And so I wouldn't be at all surprised if what you would be seeing is that eventually intelligence will be associated with in Western samples with religiosity and with conservatism, and low IQ will be associated with liberalism. I call it the Rayner effect. Whereby liberals will become stupid, and what that would potentially mean is there'll be a counter reaction. I look at this in the book, The Past, the Future Country, because it's the elite, is what the elite does that's important, what the elite thinks, whereby the elite, you'll see as people who are born in my age even retire, you'll see a percolation upwards into positions of power of intelligent religious conservatives. And this could alter the nature of the culture in a more conservative direction.
I know you've written papers on wokeness, and this is sort of coming into this kind of field here. Is there any correlation between wokeness and intelligence?
Yes, there. So precisely because there is of the effect I mentioned earlier, whereby the cognitive integration effort hypothesis, it's called, whereby people that are more intelligent are more conformist, then to the extent that society is a woke society, is a left-wing society, you would expect intelligent people like what is going to predict being like there's interesting studies on this. What is going to predict social conformity like that? One thing is intelligence. People that are more intelligent, you'd expect them to be more social conformist, and you expect them to competitively social conform. The other is elements of narcissism. So if you like being adored, if you like being looked up to, if you like people thinking you're great, then you will adopt wokeness because you will get narcissistic supply as a consequence. And there's studies that the far left are high in narcissism. Another is Machiavellianism, which is, you like power and so forth. Again, you're more likely to get power in a left-wing society if you are competitively left-wing. The key factor which seems to underpin both of those traits is neuroticism, i.e. being mentally unstable, anxious, that sort of thing. And people that are narcissistic and Machiavellian are higher in neuroticism. People that are conservative are lower in this trait, so they're less narcissistic, they're less Machiavellian, so therefore they're just less attracted to being left-wing. People that are far right, that are alt-right, whatever, they are high in psychopathic traits. So not only are they less intelligent, but they enjoy danger, they enjoy offending people, they enjoy tickling people up, and so they are high in psychopathic traits. So that's like the key difference. But overall, what you would expect at the moment, anyway, things are gradually shifting. I think things are shifting, and more intelligent people will notice that shift, and to the extent it's happening, they will get on board ahead of the game with what seems to be the up and coming thing.
Well, there has been a huge shift in society. I don't think anyone would doubt that over the past 20, 30 years or so, particularly in this movement culturally. And although you've identified some of the big five traits which would correspond or correlate to woke ideas or left ideas in some ways, is there actually a more direct measure? Is there a kind of a way of measuring wokeness in individuals? Is there an equivalent of
there is a chap. I look at this in my book Woke Eugenics. There is a chap called a researcher called Joseph Bronsky, and he has come up with a woke scale. So in the same way that you have, for example, the authoritarian scale, you have these instruments. There is a woke scale, and there's also a Finnish guy. God, his name escapes me. But me and my colleague Emil Kierkegaard did an examination of his scale recently based on Finnish data, and again, it's essentially a scale of wokeness. So he's worked out what is the essence of wokeness. He's reduced it down to a series of questions. And then you can rate a person on this.
And are there any correlations that we're aware of that?
So
anything else?
The big relationship is with mental illness. So the higher you are on this scale, the more mentally ill you are.
That's very interesting, isn't it? So what you're basically saying, the more you score on the woke scale, the more likely you are, presumably, to suffer from some kind of mental illness.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was research a while ago which found that 50% of American females who identify as very liberal have had depression or anxiety. And this goes up across time. So the younger they are, the more mentally ill. So yeah, it makes a great deal of sense, I suppose. If you think about women are higher in social anxiety than men. They're higher in generalized neuroticism than men. And so they're more likely to be mentally unstable. And what they're more likely to do is uber social conform. And if you go back 150 years, it was women that were mentally unstable like that, although there were fewer of them because we were less dysgenic back then, and so we were less mentally unstable.
Is the suggestion then that as society becomes more woke, and I think it has done over the past 10 or 20 years, I haven't measured it, but I'm assuming that's obviously the case, I would say. As it becomes more woke, are we becoming as a society more unstable?
Interesting question. There's 2 points. I think there's 2 points here to make. One is that it is becoming more woke, but there's an interesting nuance in that regard. And I know you've had my friend Eric Kaufman on here. One of the things that he's highlighted in his research is the way in which young people that are like 20 years old, are not as woke as they should be. So there's a degree to which you become more conservative with age, and you are predictably more conservative aged 40 than you are aged 20. And that's been the case for quite a long time. Now, with the most recent cohort, the Generation Z cohort, born whatever the year 2000, that's not the case. Yes, they're the most woke people in history, but they're not as woke as they should be in relation to people my age, in their mid-40s or whatever. They're not as woke as they should be. And so that's implying that something interesting is happening. And what's probably happening is that there's polarization. And that would make sense, because if you think that if you were born in 1980, and we still had teachers when I was at junior school that were born in the 20s. And the way you rebel is to be an atheist and to say it's okay to be gay and to whatever. That's how you rebel. Well, how do you rebel if you're brought up by some blue-haired weirdo who's telling you to cut your breasts off and cut your cock off and whatever? It's obvious that the edginess is with the right, and the optimum level of edginess as well, whereby it's a rebellion, but the consequences aren't too bad. So that's the first point that we have to understand, that there's a breakup, I think, that's going on, and this is what you would expect to happen once you get very, very genetically diverse, and once you get a society that basically used to get people that were genetically damaged and push them in an adaptive direction, i.e., encourage them to have children, pass on their genes, whatever. Something flipped around about 1963. And gradually, we have a society that pushes people in a maladaptive direction. Well, who's going to stand up against that? Who's going to be resistant to that? The answer is the remnant pre-industrial normal population, i.e., the genetically healthy,
Hence the rise of populism.
and basically psychopaths, and basically people that are too low in IQ to understand the benefits of conforming. And so that's who we're going to select for.
Well, that was my final question. I mean, we've spent most of our time, but I just wanted to ask you one last thing, and that is to look towards the future. Your book looks towards the future, and I think it's a rather grim-looking future that you face. Can you say something about how you see society evolving if these ideas are correct?
I see it. I don't think if they're correct. I mean, I've looked at the relationships, the relationships of.
Let's assume they are correct.
My most recent book is called Woke Eugenics, and I argue that wokeness should be understood, as I just indicated there, as a selection event. Basically, if a species or a subspecies becomes ridiculously unhealthy, eventually it will die out. It will die out either because of disease, or it will die out because let's say when the next asteroid hits the Earth in a kind of Graham Hancock kind of way, then you could imagine that if everyone is so unhealthy, then we all die off. And the only people that are left are the people that are off the grid, that are on the Andaman Islands or something. And they remember us as gods, and from there, fingerprints of the gods arises. So something has to hit in to stop that happening. And that thing is wokeness. So we have it's a genetic group level adaptation, which gets a species which, due to the Industrial Revolution, has become fantastically physically and mentally unhealthy, and it forces it back to health, so that it survives across time. How does it do that? Well, it does that first of all by the woke becoming these mutants, basically these mutants with their maladaptive ideas, becoming a certain percentage of the population, then taking over the apparatus of culture, and then pushing everybody in a maladaptive direction, so that everybody except the highly genetically healthy, who will also be religious and conservative, as I said, gets sucked into a death cult. So we become healthy once again. The second thing it does is it crashes civilization. So it encourages more intelligent women to resign from the gene pool. It pressures more intelligent people to resign from the gene pool. It forces us to become less intelligent. So we crash civilization. We reimpose harsher Darwinian conditions, again ensuring that we remain healthy across time. The third thing it does is it promotes interesting factors that remove the less intelligent, or the non-ethnocentric from the in-group. So those that are not of an ethnocentric bent, they're sucked into the death cult, they die out. Those that have low IQ, they imbibe wokeness. It tells them to outbreed, which is, by the way, low IQ predicts outbreeding, to outbreed, to stop being part of the ethnic in-group. So they're out. So what you're then left with is a relatively intelligent, healthy, conservative, ethnocentric group, which will then successfully fight in the coming battle of group selection with other such groups and will ultimately survive across time until eventually, it's harsh selection for intelligence and we have a new rise of civilization. But that's all Darwin or nature cares about. It cares about the fact the species survives.
And it sounds very much to me that it's like a Hobbesian end to our civilization, with everything being nasty and brutish and rather short.
Oh yeah, except that Rome didn't completely collapse. Rome, in a very diluted form, maintained itself in Byzantium. And what I would predict is that this is what is going to happen. So you're going to get this selection for this kind of based, intelligent, healthy group of people, and they will retreat amid the general chaos to a kind of Byzantium, or a number of Byzantiums.
But then Byzantium was utterly eradicated eventually, wasn't it?
It was utterly eradicated eventually, but by then the people that were in it, the selection pressures had brought about a place where the knowledge could go to, and then it could jumpstart the new rise of civilization. So I just think we've seen this now. We've seen the Bronze Age collapse, we've seen the Roman collapse, and we're going to see our collapse. The parallels are fascinating. I mean, if you look at Sir John Glubb's book, The Fate of Empires, at this stage, it's always the same: multiculturalism, feminism, homosexuality. It's always the same. And then there's a collapse, and there's a holdout in a certain area, and then it rises up again. And they noted, interestingly, if you look at our Wits End, we look at this from Ovid and people like this, that the higher classes weren't breeding, and they were noticing this around about the time, and Augustus tried to bring in a tax to force them to do so, and they paid the tax. And so we're seeing exactly the same thing. And it's a process whereby humans seem to create these civilizations because they're so intelligent. This makes them unhealthy. Something has to come in to force them to collapse. That is wokeness or Gnosticism or something like that. But something comes in to force them to collapse. They collapse, they carry on, and they remain healthy across time and survive. And I think this
Edward Dutton, thank you ever so much. We've come to the end of our time. Thank you ever so much for an excellent and fascinating conversation. I have read this book at our Wits End, and I strongly recommend it to you. And of course, this new book, which I have not yet read, the woke. What was it called?
I'm gonna get it. Excuse me.
But this one can be found still on Amazon
Well, they're all on Amazon, but this is woke eugenics.
Woke eugenics.
And there's also a successor to that one called The Past as a Future Country. So yes.
It's another book for my Christmas list then. But Ed Dutton, thank you ever so much for your time.
Pleasure to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Because you're taking quite a risk interviewing based people like me and Eric Kaufman.
Do you think so?
In the current climate.
I'm retired from my thing.
So I know that's what I'm saying. So you can get away with it. You haven't got to think about a job.
Well, I have had complaints made to my management in the past, over the past couple of years or so. I've had 2 or 3 complaints from people who didn't like what I was doing for some reason. And all I can say is the university was quite good. I did remind them that that academic freedom is an important thing, and independence of thought is like the lifeblood of a university, and they seem to be fine. And in fact, the last time someone complained about my comments, they didn't even contact me. They just dealt with it privately, so that was fine by me.
I wonder what's going on. I think that there's obviously Bournemouth is next Polytechnic, isn't it, or something?
Well, it's a 1992 university, so it sort of converted to.
I think there's more pressure on, because that's the thing with the woke. They go for that which is powerful.
Yeah.
So there's more pressure on something like Oxford or Cambridge or Durham or Bristol or whatever. There's more pressure on them.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
The only real pressure I've had, and disappointingly, is that YouTube has taken off some of my videos. So I've spoken to, famous cardiologists in America who the world leading authority during COVID who had an alternative viewpoint, and they just took it off after a few days. I had to put it on Rumble and places like that where tens of thousands of people have seen it. But it's sad that there's not this free, open marketplace of ideas.
That's very interesting. Would you be interested in coming on my podcast?
I'd be very happy to do so.
I think that would, because it's so rare that there's still a bridge end of this. There's a number of, obviously, like, I work for myself. I have my own stuff, my own bits of business essentially. But I know a number of people that are still working in academia properly. Like, not like I am right. Like, actually, they need the money, properly, the proper job. And the pressure even now is just terrible. And you do things like you talk about race in an article, but you don't use the word race.
Yes,
or you draw upon Richard Lynn's research, but you don't mention it. So you basically plagiarize him. because to draw upon him would be.
But what an indictment of the higher educational system, which depends for its entire survival on contestable ideas and airing contestable ideas so that you can challenge every idea and then it can be taken forward. But at the moment, we're living in a society where misinformation, disinformation is now going to prevent people from being people who would.
I think there's a sort of priestly cycle of academia.
Yeah.
I look at this in my book, The Past, Future Country. It's founded by genius types. It becomes prestigious to people that are normal range intelligence. They put conformity above pursuit of truth. They turn it into a church.
Yeah.
It then all the geniuses leave. So you get like a 19th century situation where you get the dissenting academies and the independent scholars and people like this, and then they reform or die.